2025 is starting off strong here on the Space Coast of Florida. We have finally seen the maiden flight of Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket. SpaceX has made great progress on the huge expansion of their Roberts Road complex that could eventually dwarf the company's Starbase facilities, and plans have surfaced highlighting brand new landing zones for Falcon 9 right at their launch complexes, 39A and Slick 40. Howdy everybody, my name is Max Evans for NSF, and we've got all of that and a whole lot more coming up on this month's Space Coast Flyover. Y'all already know the drill, as we've got some company along for this episode. Alex and Adrian are coming along for the ride to review all that we've spotted this time round. More from them in a bit. But first, to SpaceX's Roberts Road facility, where SpaceX is continuing with its massive northern expansion, Phase 1. As we've outlined before in previous flights, this northern expansion will increase the available work area that SpaceX will have at Roberts Road for what we've presumed Starship-related activity. Until recently, we could only guess that this was for Starship, as SpaceX already has plenty of room at the Cape to support its Falcon family of rockets for East Coast operations. However, there's no need to guess anymore. Since our last flyover, documentation has been published that confirms this is where SpaceX will manufacture the world's largest and most powerful rocket, right here in Florida. Let's go step by step, because there is a lot to unpack here. First, we have 5 different documents from the FAA, which are all part of what's called an OE-AAA filing process. OE-AAA stands for Obstruction Evaluation Airport Airspace Analysis. These documents are standard process whenever any organization aims to build a structure tall enough to potentially alter the airspace traffic around the area. These documents in particular relate to a new structure to be built at the north expansion at Roberts Road, labeled as SpaceX Giga Bay. This is the same nomenclature that we've seen for some buildings at Starbase, like High Bay and Mega Bay, so this confirms that the north expansion is definitely for Starship. Of course, the use of Giga instead of High or Mega clearly implies that SpaceX's intentions are of even grander scale than what we've seen so far in Starbase, which is pretty hard to believe. The 5 documents include the dimensions of the building, and each one contains a different coordinate location. 4 pages for the corners of the building and 1 for the center. As a result, we know that this Giga Bay should be approximately 110 meters wide, 130 meters long, and 116 meters tall. That's 360 by 427 by 380 feet for all of those using Imperial. Now, a lot of people have been wondering how this compares to other large buildings used to build rockets, us included. For example, let's compare it to the Mega Bays at Starbase. Each one is approximately 38 meters wide, 54 meters long, and 99 meters tall. This means that the upcoming Giga Bay would have a footprint nearly 7 times larger than the Mega Bays, leaving plenty of room for a massive production cadence here. The 2 Mega Bays at Starbase can work on up to 3 fully stacked vehicles simultaneously while building a 4th. Given the dimensions, it's safe to say that Giga Bay will probably have enough room to fit around a dozen fully stacked vehicles, while simultaneously having the ability to build multiple ships and boosters. However, that's assuming SpaceX combines the stacking and processing of both vehicles here. SpaceX has plenty of room at the Roberts Road North expansion to fit another Giga Bay here should they wish, and dedicate each one to boosters or ships. Critically, this monster structure is also tall enough to fit future stretched versions of the ship and the booster, with room to spare for an office building, a lounge, or a bar on the roof, just like we've seen at Starbase. Now, with all of this being said, it would be a crime to not compare Giga Bay to NASA's Vehicle Assembly Building, as it's not far down the road, right behind me in fact. Despite being larger than the Mega Bays at Starbase, Giga Bay still doesn't compare to how huge the VAB is. Accounting for both high and low bays, as well as the transfer aisles, the VAB is approximately 158 meters wide, 218 meters long, and 160 meters tall. There's enough area inside to fit roughly 2.5 Giga Bays, and it's so tall that even a fully stacked Starship Block 3 configuration could fit inside. And mind you, the VAB finished construction in 1966, nearly 60 years ago. Included in the FAA documentation is a time period for construction, stating April 1st, 2025 to August 2nd, 2026, which more or less tracks with how long a building of this scale would take to finish. While SpaceX has been clearing the area at north of Roberts Road for the past 2 months or so, it has focused special attention to where Giga Bay will be built. As we can see, the area has already been cleared and flattened ahead of foundation work. As we've mentioned in previous flyovers, the north expansion actually has 2 phases, and the work that we're currently seeing is for phase 1. Since our last flyover, SpaceX has submitted documentation relating to the impact on the wetlands around the facility. This study states that, quote, Phase 2 of this development will include drainage for the future development of a 1.5 million square foot operations facility used for vehicle and payload processing, fabrication, storage, manufacturing, and shipping and receiving. This sounds like SpaceX aims to build a version of the Star Factory here on Phase 2. And what's even more interesting is that the footprint of 1.5 million square feet is 50% larger than the facility at Starbase, which is around 1 million square feet. Star Factory 2.0, as I call it, and the Giga Bay combined would dwarf the current facilities at Starbase and will be capable of supplying the hardware output needed for the launch cadence that SpaceX needs to support future missions for Starlink, the Artemis program, and the company's own mission of reaching Mars. Elsewhere on Roberts Road, SpaceX continues tidying up with newly paved roads, fences, and gates that now surround its different facilities. In our last flyover, we saw that teams had begun staging parts for Starship's new launch mount that will be set at Launch Complex 39A. We can now see that these pieces are starting to be put together in the rolling tent located on the complex's south side. From what we've seen, the design of this launch mount so far appears to be mirroring that being built for Pad B in Starbase, the main difference here being that this mount is still in its infancy. The launch mount consists of 3 layers, and they're all being put together using pedestals anchored to the ground. These pedestals are already on the ground, and the corner pieces for the base layer are already installed. These corner pieces will be joined soon by the 4 longer sections that make up the sides of the square, completing the base layer. Following the base layer, the core will be added, which contains all of the hold-down arms and a circular opening for a booster to fit into. We can see the core's 4 corners already staged nearby as well. To compare the progress seen here to Pad B's in Starbase, that one had its core layer being installed when Jack flew over Starbase on October 31st of last year. Now, because there's a 3.5 month gap between each launch mount, perhaps Pad B's in Starbase will serve as, I guess, foreshadowing for that being constructed for LC-39A. You can watch our latest Starbase update to see how that looks, which also features a flyover of the SpaceX site. Now, with all of that being said, SpaceX is not the only launch provider expanding its facilities here at the Cape. Now, here's Adrian with the latest on what Blue Origin has been up to over the last month. Adrian?
Well, since our last flyover, it's probably quite safe to say that Blue Origin has been busy with, the first launch of New Glenn and all. To give you a quick recap, New Glenn lifted off from Launch Complex 36 on January 16, and it not only had a successful liftoff, but made it all the way to its final intended orbit. That's right, on the company's first ever orbital launch attempt, they successfully made it to orbit. That's impressive. But unfortunately, the first stage didn't make it to the landing phase of its flight, although it's worth mentioning this was not in the list of main goals for the mission. As Blue had stated many times, this was just a secondary mission to gather data on New Glenn's recovery. The chances were low, but they were there, which is why the booster was called So You're Telling Me There's a Chance. And it's also why Blue sent its Jacqueline barge out there at sea. They now have learned lots from this flight, so hopefully they will get much closer next time, or even land it. More on that later in the video. As of now, Blue is likely in an intense phase of pouring through data to see what they can learn from this first launch. And this includes the launch pad itself. We all know that launch pads and their ground support equipment, or GSE, take quite the beating during launches. And with this being the first launch from the current Launch Complex 36, it is safe to say that even the engineers working at the pad have learned a lot about what fared well and not so well during the intense conditions of launch. During our flight, the pad itself was rather quiet and empty from our perspective. I'm assuming that a lot of attention is on the transporter erector, which is currently inside of the integration facility. With the TE being home to so many systems that connect the rocket and pad, Blue is likely wanting to get a start on any refurbishment work as quickly as possible. This should ensure the structure is ready for the next launch attempt, which they are aiming for as soon as the second quarter of this year. And of course, the next flight of New Glenn won't be possible without the rocket itself. So let's head up to Exploration Park to see what's going on at Rocket Park, as Blue likes to call their campus. We know that the hardware for New Glenn's next flight is well into production, since Blue Origin itself showed it off in the background during the company's coverage of the first flight of New Glenn. As it turns out, we might have been lucky enough to catch a very brief glimpse of one of the pieces during our flight. At the surface coating facility, a door was cracked open, and we can see what might be the second stage for Flight 2 receiving its thermal insulation. If we take a look at the shots from the Blue Origin webcast, we can in fact see that the second stage in production at the time did not have any of its thermal insulation installed. So it's very likely that this is the same second stage. According to Blue Origin CEO Dave Limp, the company has 7 or 8 second stages currently in production behind this one, and aims to get to a production rate of about 48 second stages a year. So we should hopefully catch many more sites like this in the future. But rocket stages are not the only thing we should see an increase of over the coming years. Recent planning documents submitted to the US Army Corps of Engineers show that Blue wants to even further expand its facilities at Rocket Park. How much? A lot. Seriously. Check this out. Right now, Blue has 10 complete buildings at the site, with another 4 actively under construction. These new plans show at least another 13 more buildings that will be added to the site by the end of 2028. These buildings include integration facilities, testing areas, metal forming and maintenance facilities, a few vehicle storage facilities, and more. The rough footprint of all of these buildings combined comes to about 3.2 million square feet or 72 acres. I think it's safe to say that Blue will not only be keeping us occupied with rockets, but also lots of construction. Speaking of construction, let's go through some updates of the buildings currently under construction, starting with a new structure rising from the ground. During our last flyover, we spotted foundations for the long-awaited chemical processing facility. Since then, those foundations have gained a concrete slab and the building skeleton has begun to take shape. We really don't know much about what this building will be used for, other than what its name implies, but if you have any ideas, feel free to let us know in the comments below. Another building, much further along in its construction, is Lunar Plant 1, where Blue Origin will manufacture and process its Blue Moon lunar landers. This large facility has grown a lot since we last see it. There appears to be at least one bridge crane already installed inside the building, with another 2 much larger bridge cranes on the backs of a truck preparing to be installed. On the roof, there appears to be some sort of prefab units that we believe could be used for clean room air filtration. These large units will ensure that the high bays are kept free of contaminations when the spacecraft are being assembled. The building is also gaining the signature blue paneling on the outside, keeping it in line with the rest of the buildings on site. Just to the north, between Lunar Plant 1 and the main manufacturing building, another large plot of land is being prepared for one of the new buildings. This will be eventually the hardware integration facility, which we are assuming is where New Glenn's first stages will undergo final integration before being rolled out to the launch site. This includes events such as the forward and aft modules being integrated with the tank section, BE4 integration, the addition of the aero surfaces, and more. This building is in a much better location for these operations compared to the current GS1 integration facility, which is further away from the factory. Across the road from Blue's ever-expanding factory, Airbus OneWeb's satellite manufacturing facility expansion appears to be mostly complete from our point of view. This new 49,000 square foot expansion will allow the factory to meet increased demands for satellites from all customers. At this rate, it's likely that all of the finishing exterior touches will be completed in the next several weeks. Now, I will hand it over to Alex with the latest on SpaceX launch pads, including more Starship-related activity.
There's definitely a lot going on at SpaceX's launch pads, and it's not just because they launched 14 times from Florida since our last flyover episode. The company has also been making great progress at the Starship launch site within Launch Complex 39A. One of the major places of activity there is at the launch mount area, where in the last few weeks we've seen the arrival of a drilling rig and crane. Working in tandem, they've started to install the foundations that will support the launch mount for this Starship launch pad. This process has been going on already for a few weeks, and in the time since, SpaceX teams have had to open the launch tower chopsticks manually in order to leave room for this process. At the time of the flyover, the drilling rig was working on the easternmost side of the future launch mount area, an area which we assume will look a lot like the one at Pad B at Starbase. This is in part because, as Max explained earlier in the video, the launch mount being assembled at Roberts Road is pretty much a copy of the one being assembled for Pad B at Starbase. There at Starbase, SpaceX is building a massive flame trench and flame bucket that will divert the flow of the Raptor's exhaust in two directions. The flame bucket and launch mount will also be water-cooled, with a larger amount of water expected to be used there than at Pad A. It's clear that at least the launch mount will be similar, but we don't really know if SpaceX will truly mirror this at 39A. If we look at the map, well, let's say that diverting the Raptor's exhaust in the same way as it's being done at Pad B would affect some of the surrounding hardware. For example, to the northeast, it will encounter the liquid methane tank farm, which is definitely not ideal, and to the southwest, it will have a lot more room, but it will eventually hit the Falcon horizontal iteration facility. And it's not like diverting the exhaust any other way will help. If they divert it anywhere from straight east to straight south, there's a road in the way that's critical for many people in hardware at KSC to go over to the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. I mean, even SpaceX uses that road to transport boosters and fairings. It's possible that SpaceX may mirror some of the stuff we've seen for Pad B at Starbase, but it's clear that they're gonna have to come up with some ways of preventing that exhaust from roasting critical infrastructure. Another piece of major progress has been removing the big liquid oxygen tank that was built between the Falcon launch mount and the Starship launch tower. If on our last flyover episode it was just being cut up, now it's completely gone and down to rubble on the ground. Something that is also gone from LC-39A are the cryo lines that came out of the methane tank farm and out to the tower. On our last flyover, only a portion of these had been removed, but in this one, all of them are gone. We can also see excavators in the area, including one by the small retention pond near the methane tank farm. As I speculated on our last flyover, it wouldn't be surprising if SpaceX were to move all of those cryogenic lines underground and carry them out to the launch tower and mount without being in the way. This flyover, we also spotted a crane working on the back of the Starship launch tower, so perhaps this might be related work. Now, this is all that's been happening on the east side of 39A, but on the west side, there's even more groundwork going on. This groundwork is located right next to the liquid oxygen tank farm at 39A, which is currently only being used by Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy. It is next to this location where SpaceX is proposing to install an air separation unit to be able to extract nitrogen and oxygen from the air and use it for Starship's operations. Seems like the work for this has already started, and it even seems like teams have marked the work area with a fence. But while SpaceX keeps working on all the Starship hardware at 39A, Falcon 9 rockets do still launch from this pad. It's something that we've been asked often. How does the Falcon launch cadence affect all of the Starship work? Don't they have to stop for a long time every time SpaceX launches? Well, the reality is that it doesn't seem like the disruption is all that big. If a launch is happening at 39A, normally we see work stopping around 5 to 6 hours prior to the launch, and then resumes about 2 to 3 hours after. Falcon 9 is a well-oiled machine with hundreds of launches in its belt, which means operations are a lot smoother than for other rockets, so it takes very little time out of the Starship work. And if a launch happens from Space Launch Complex 40, then that's far enough away that it doesn't seem to affect operations, other than maybe some operators looking at the rocket as it lifts off. I don't know, like maybe 2 minutes of interruption. Now, something that might disrupt things a little in the future is when rockets start coming back from space right at Launch Complex 39A. And not referring to Super Heavy or Starship yet, I'm referring to Falcon, and to explain why this is the case, we gotta go back to 2023. That's when the Space Launch Delta 45 announced it was leasing Launch Complex 13 to 2 launch companies, Via Space and Phantom Space. If that launch complex sounds familiar, it is because that's where SpaceX's landing zones 1 and 2 are located. But that lease wasn't given right at the moment, it was rather subject to the existing lease with SpaceX coming to an end. Without landing zones 1 and 2 available, SpaceX will need some place to land its boosters when they return to land, and in the last couple of months we've seen documentation for that alternative plan. SpaceX is planning to build landing zones at Launch Complex 39A and also at Space Launch Complex 40. The landing area at LC-39A will be located to the north of the complex, while the landing area at Slick 40 will be located to the east of the complex. We don't know if there'll be one or more landing zones within each area, but there's definitely room for more than one within them. It totally makes sense to put the landing pad right next to where the launch pad is. After all, that's already what's going on at SpaceX's West Coast launch site. But at the Cape, it's not all about the launch pads, though. We also have rocket recovery assets at Port Canaveral. During this flyover, our Cape team was lucky enough to capture all 3 East Coast drone ships in port together: Blue Origin's Jacqueline and SpaceX's Just Read the Instructions and a chauffeur of Gravitas. It's quite a rare sight to see this these days, as normally SpaceX's drone ships are both busy at sea, and at least until recently, Jacqueline was also supporting the booster landing for New Glen's first flight. By the way, shout out to the folks getting some pain on Just Read the Instructions. We all know it's gonna get roasted again, but they still do it anyway. Okay, now it's probably a good moment to check in with the other rocket companies around the Space Coast. They may not be as active, but they still are getting a lot of work done. An example of this is Stoke and the work going on at the company's Launch Complex 14. Things are moving quite fast there as the company prepares the site to support launches of its fully reusable Nova rocket. While Stoke is still clearing the land and setting up burn-offs, they've already begun installing the tanks for the launch site's tank farm. In the flyover views, we can also see a drilling rig working at the area where Stoke is planning to install the launch mount for Nova. And if we roll over to neighboring Launch Complex 16, Relativity continues with the work on the foundations for Terranar's horizontal integration facility and for the rocket's flame trench at the site. Another company that has been very quiet lately is United Launch Alliance, at least until last week. ULA is still in the process of certifying its Vulcan rocket for military missions. We presume the rocket is still nestled inside of the company's vertical integration facility at Space Launch Complex 41, awaiting for its certification ahead of the installation of the USSF-106 payload. But this past week, Amazon announced it had shipped the first operational Kuiper satellites to the Cape for a launch soon. And then ULA CEO Terry Bruno said on Blue Sky that ULA's next launch is coming very soon and on an Atlas, so it seems like we may have to wait a bit until that Vulcan rocket is launched. And speaking of things that may take a while to happen, let's go to NASA's Mobile Launcher 2. Yeah, I did that. Jokes apart, this is the mobile launcher set to be used for NASA's SLS Block 1B rocket, starting with the Artemis 4 mission. Since our last flyover, teams from the Exploration Ground Systems have installed the first module of the launch tower on top of the launch tower chair. We can also see they have also installed a lot of scaffolding for access to the work areas, and they might even be setting up a set of stairs as well. This module is the first of 4 expected to make up the entirety of the launch tower, something that's expected to be complete by the end of the year.
And that's going to wrap it up here on this edition of Space Coast Flyover. 2025 is a year that promises a lot of action here at America's premier spaceport, and we'll be here to cover it all as it happens. I'm Max Evans with NSF, and thanks for tuning in.